Hi, everybody. Thank you for watching this video of the presentation that occurred on February 25th at the North Branch Library. Here at PETAL, we decided to go ahead and do a little recording of this for the people who couldn't make it. So to begin, my name is Sarah. I'm a Texas Master Naturalist, a native plant enthusiast, and yeah, someone who just loves to hang out with plants on a regular basis. Um, I developed this presentation in an effort to sort of give people some really small and practical tools that they could use to practice restoration at home. So we'll start with an introduction, and then we'll go into the primary goals of the workshop. We'll discuss some definitions and concepts, and then we'll touch on native and invasive plants, looking at examples of those. And in the workshop, we had a planning session. I want to encourage you to take out a pen and paper or pull up your favorite software and maybe jot down some ideas for your own restoration projects at home. So I want to begin with this with a land acknowledgement. We are in Denton, Texas, but this is the ancestral and unceded land of the Wichita, Kickapoo, and Tauaconi people. And a lot of the restoration techniques that we have today come from Indigenous knowledge. So it's important that we, yeah, make that acknowledgement and recognize that we have much to learn from Indigenous people, despite yeah, their presence in our everyday lives or not. Yeah, so this workshop is done on behalf of the Texas PETAL project. The PETAL stands for Participatory Environmentalism Through Art and Learning. And the goal of our organization is to provide creative and educational opportunities. We want to cultivate a purposeful community environmental literacy. We want to engage you in your environment. We want you to get out there and enjoy nature, and work with nature, and use your creativity to promote natural systems that are around you. Let's talk about some definitions surrounding conservation and restoration. So native plants. Native plants are indigenous species that have evolved in a particular region, and they existed prior to colonial efforts in North America. And they represent a number of different life forms, including trees, conifer and hardwood, shrubs, grasses, forbs, flowering plants. Native plants are all around us. Now, they might not be as present as some invasive species, but this is what we mean when we're talking about native plants. Restoration, as a concept, we're looking at four factors related to restoration. So revegetation of an existing ecosystem that may have been, devegetated for some reason, could be overgrazing, could be agriculture, could have to do with land development. Habitat enhancement is another factor, and that's just, maybe making way for the natives that are there already. They just need a little bit of space to grow and proliferate. Remediation is sort of restoring a habitat that has been degraded in some sense due to all the factors that I mentioned during the revegetation portion. And then mitigation is when legal factors come in. So maybe a municipality says, in order to be Tree City USA, we have to have this many trees in a square mile. So at-home restoration is all of those things at home. So the mitigation factor comes in when you have programs like wilderness certifications that give you a tax break on your land, or when you make your front yard a monarch way station. So these are the ways that the individual and the state can kind of like come into contact with one another and sort of work together in a way. However, there's a lot that you can do without uh, the support of your municipality. Invasive plants are not native to the ecosystem. They're introduced, and that introduction causes harm to an economic or environmental sphere or to human health. So, right here we have invasive privet. This is probably one of the most pervasive invasive plants in this area and maybe across the entire US. I'd have to look into that. But um, what this particular plant does is it shades out, it forms thickets and hedges that shade out other native plants, making it difficult for them to keep their ecological foothold. And they support, the whole hierarchy of of wildlife relies on producers, which are plants, and we'll talk about that. So, isn't any plant that spreads aggressively invasive? Not necessarily, because you can have a native plant that does very, very well in a particular region and tends to be fairly aggressive. And while it does kind of push out other plants, it still has a benefit to wildlife. So, a couple of examples of that: passion flower vine is very aggressive in the garden. You don't want to plant it with a slower growing plant, or red trumpet vine is another one. It can go all the way up a tree and wrap completely around trees. But often, even though it's doing that, it's not preventing the tree from growing. So yeah, it really depends on who you ask here. And in this case, we've got three majorly invasive plants right here. We've got on the left Bermuda grass, which is, it's a mat forming grass. It can, have its roots can develop very deeply in the ground. It's very difficult to get rid of. It's difficult to tell what grass it is when there's no seed heads. So these seed heads here on the left are characteristic of Bermuda grass. In the middle here, we have the Bartlett pear tree, which is, it's not native to the area. It smells nice when it first blooms, but then you might know Bradford pear from the wretched smell that it emits. A couple of weeks after it blooms, the flowers begin to fade and then they start to rot, and the tree just kind of smells like dead fish. Um, Even though the trees do very well here, they don't have a long life in this particular ecosystem, and they can just fall over in like 10 to 15 years. And they get fairly tall. They're not the tallest trees, but they're hazardous to plant in this area. And here on the right, we have probably one of my favorite invasives because it smells great, and I have childhood memories of hanging out in the forest and eating the honeysuckle flowers. But Japanese honeysuckle is a hugely invasive plant here in this area, in this temperate region that we live in. It tends to also form, big thickets and shade out other plants that are, that would otherwise be um, useful to the ecosystem. And while this plant does attract pollinators to some extent, it's not food for any of our native pollinators. So let's talk about our ecoregions. So yeah, what ecosystem are we living in? So we're here where that purple mass and that tan mass meet is around where we are right here, and that is at the intersection of the Eastern Cross Timbers, which is part of the Oak Woods and Prairies, and the Blackland Prairie. And so Eastern Cross Timbers has, characteristic geology of like sandstone, mudstone, a little bit of limestone. You're going to find oaks, hickories. You'll find other trees interspersed there, but the dominant trees are oak and hickory. On the Blackland Prairie, you have this really rich, black, fertile soil that is produced by buildup of dead vegetation that has decayed over centuries. And interspersed through the Blackland Prairie, you'll find mesquite, honey locust, yeah, different hardwood trees, cedars, and and those can actually be a little bit of a difficulty when you're trying to maintain a prairie ecosystem. Some of these trees are really fast growing. And it's not that they don't support wildlife, but they do encroach on the prairie and make it difficult for the prairie to maintain itself. So why is the prairie important? Well, basically right here at the bottom of this pyramid, we've got plants. And the prairie is comprised mostly of native plants. These plants feed every, all those other sections right above there. Herbivores, primary predators, and secondary predators all rely on the prairie, if not directly, tangentially. So yeah, without the native plants, the herbivores don't have anything to feed on. And when the herbivores don't have anything to feed on, the primary predators don't, and therefore the secondary predators don't as well. Also, as non-natives decay, they don't necessarily feed our native detrivores, which are part of what keeps the soil healthy, helps prevent soil erosion. So um, that's why it's important to maintain the prairie as an ecosystem. So here are some numbers about turf grass. Okay, yeah, so this is specifically looking at non-native turf grass. So gas mowers represent 5% of air pollution in the United States. It takes up 2% of the land here, and it's much more expensive to install as opposed to installing a native habitat. You're going to also have 30 to 60% of urban freshwater used on lawns annually, which is quite a lot considering that, in years of drought, we're asked to sort of conserve that water. With native plants, you're going to find that you won't even have to worry about any sort of water limitation. And if we all planted a section, maybe less than a third of our lawn with native plants, then we could create a 20 million acre national park that's bigger than Yosemite and Shenandoah. So, yeah, let's do it. Let's work together. So, as I was sort of intimating earlier, you don't need a lot of water for your native plants. Your native plants need some water to get established, but after that, they do not really need any water. In times of drought, you might have to water them like maybe once a week, once every other week. You don't need to fertilize them. A lot of times, fertilizer is going to actually cause them to perform not as well. So you can avoid fertilizers altogether. This also makes it so that there's not any leaching of fertilizer into the soil or the surrounding waterways. You can support your local ecology. So any sort of like species of birds or mammals or insects that you enjoy seeing at your local nature reserve, chances are likely that you can attract them to your home. And you provide a biodiverse habitat for the existing species that are there. So it's just focusing a little more on natives is not only going to help you conserve a lot of your time and your energy and your money, it's also going to benefit the environment around you. This photo right here is a photo of cucamelon, which is actually a native forage plant here in Texas. It's a cucurbit, and it just kind of sprung up in my backyard a couple of years ago, and it forms these little cucamelons, which taste just like cucumber. Although they do ripen and they turn purple, and you don't want to eat them then because then they act as a purgative. But when they're like this, they're good to go. So they're a great plant too. They will if you have an area that needs some coverage, they're great for that. So here's a few different approaches for restoration at home. You can focus on a particular species of wildlife that you want to attract to your yard. You like certain butterflies, so you plant certain plants, or you just plant your favorite natives. You just like the look of a plant, that you have a spot for it, so you plant that. Or you could focus on your soil. If you have a really sandy soil, you could be xeriscaping, or if you have a really woodland area, you could focus on woodland species. Alternatively, if you have like a full sun open field, you could focus specifically on prairie plants. You could also just simply remove the invasives that are in your yard. It's always good to follow up with some kind of planting or seeding, so that they have less likelihood of coming back. Or you can just make way for the natives that exist there. And chances are there's some natives just hanging out in your yard or hanging out in the hell strip next to your house. So here are some ways that you can incorporate natives into your landscape. You can do a complete removal of like a non-native lawn and broadcast sow some native grasses and forbs. You can also do a little less chaotic version of that by just planting a cottage style garden where you have small, little bundles of native plants that require a little more maintenance than just a broadcast sowing would, but that's one way to do it. And a lot of people seem to like that aesthetically. You can also plant your non-native annuals amongst the native plants. You'll find that those non-native annuals that need pollination to fruit are more likely to do it because you've got plants around that native bee species, flies, beetles like. So yeah, so that's what I've done, and I haven't found that I've had a lot of issues with pests. I've actually found that some of these native plants are attracting the beneficial insects like the taconid flies, the parasitic wasps, the hoverflies. Those are the insects that come in and eat those, pests, agricultural pests. And then you can also just you could be clearing invasives as well as doing these other techniques. You can repeatedly cut privet bushes as they sprout up. Um, if you have a large land mass, you could be doing like controlled burns. If you have a wisteria that has like a trunk this big, you can cut it down, make a little hole, and burn that out, in a very controlled manner that won't allow it to spread in the right conditions. I would recommend consulting some experts on that before you get down to it. And then, yeah, and you could also be using one way that a way that I've learned about restoration is through hopping on some larger scale projects, like helping out at Leela and helping out at Clear Creek. In some instances, there's the use of targeted herbicides. I have never done that at home. I'm not sure that I would, but that's definitely something you could look into if you're interested. Um, and that particular technique kind of comes from a paradigm in conservation that sort of like looks at all invasives and says, they're evil, we need to get rid of them, kill it with fire, which is definitely a thing you could do. But indigenous people have been, publishing literature recently that discusses those techniques in a different light, where even in, those plants classed as invasive are considered plant relatives, and they are basically we can still remove them, but as we remove them, we're using them for something. So, like, I have a giant swath of bamboo in my backyard. I can use that bamboo as I'm clearing it to build structures, to build trellises, or some of the plants can actually be used as medicines. Or even, cosmetics, perfumes, that honeysuckle flower, it tastes great. You can make a syrup out of it, just there's lots of different things you can do with these plants that don't necessarily involve using targeted herbicides, although that is a technique. So let's talk about some of our native superstars. So oaks are they are the biggest host for pollinators in the United States. They host tons of moth and butterfly species, and there's lots of birds that eat those caterpillars. And there's plenty of other insects that nest in oaks. And they're lovely. They're lovely trees. There's evergreen oaks if you're interested in those, planting more trees. If that's a thing you want to do and that works for your ecosystem, there's lots of different oaks to choose from. Red buds are blooming right now, so you might be able to catch one out in the wild and you can smell it. And they smell great right now. I actually saw one over at TWU. Um, and then we've got Maximilian sunflower. It's great for bee species, flies. Um, it's definitely a plant that you don't want to plant in a small cottage garden, though, because it spreads. And having landscaped these plants a little bit, you know, we've definitely had to take some out of areas because they just take over. But if you've got a large, open field, excellent plant to plant in a place where it can just spread out. American beautyberry is a wonderful woodland plant that loves to be planted under the shade of trees. I see it when I go out to Ray Roberts under the loblolly pine there. And the plants produce these beautiful small purple berries that they taste really good. They're really minuscule. So most people, when they're, you know, if they're harvesting the berries to consume, because you can eat them, they're usually using them in jellies and syrups. But excellent plant overall. Fall aster is such an incredible plant. I just planted one near, the rest of my garden. And when I walk by in the spring when the flowers are in bloom, they're just covered in insects. So, yeah, that is a great plant to have, and it smells wonderful and looks wonderful. Blooms for a long time. Blooms from spring through end of fall here in North Texas. We've got the fragrant mist flower, which is excellent butterfly food, really good for the monarchs who are making their way through this area, especially in fall. It's another one that blooms late summer through fall, so not as long as our fall aster, but it does bloom for a long time. And we've got Flamicanthus, which is great for attracting hummingbirds to your garden. Those tubular flowers are just basically evolved for tiny little beaks to go in and lap up some nectar. Attracts other pollinators as well, and stays, the blooms open in I think early summer and they stay through the fall as well. And inland sea oats are a wonderful way to add interest to your garden throughout the seasons. These grow just to about a foot tall. They'll spread out if you want them to spread out. And they start out with these beautiful green seed heads that, they start to go gold and then brown over fall and winter. And so, lovely way to add interest to the garden. So what can you do right now? Right now in February, which is when we're doing this, you could be clearing invasives. You could be, repeatedly cutting those woody invasives. You could be digging up the roots. You want to do a little bit of research before you try to do that, just to determine whether or not that's the best option going forward. If it's kind of cold, I would recommend not digging up the roots because you can harm the soil microbes and the bacteria and the fungi that are in there. Do it when the soil temperature is a little bit higher, and then you could be harvesting those invasives. So you could be, if you want to weave a basket out of some privet, you could be harvesting those branches to do that, or you could be using the bamboo to create your tomato trellises for the year. You could be sowing native seed of like prairie forbs and flowering plants indoors. Most of them require cold stratification, so you want to be throwing them probably in the freezer in some substrate before you try to germinate them. Yeah, I saw this really cool way to, just your most basic way to germinate hard to germinate seeds is, you can just throw them in between a wet paper towel, wait for the sprouts to come, and then pop them into some soil, harden them off, and transplant them out. And speaking of which, we're in that period where you could be transplanting native transplants. You've got between like January and May, as long as it's not freezing, it's a pretty okay time to be doing that. And then you could be sowing native grasses now. So January through March is the general time for broadcasting native grass seed, and getting some of those really awesome native grasses established. You could be building beds for your native plants. If you haven't decided what you want to plant yet, you could sheet mulch, and probably have your sheet mulching situation ready by about the end of planting time. You could also just amend the native soil with a little bit of like compost. Depending on the soil that you have, if it's clay soil, you could really just add a little bit of fertility. And you could condition the soil in your existing beds for new transplants. But remember, these are native plants, so you don't have to do much for them. Let's identify some invasive plants. Sadly, a lot of these are really pretty, and and they might even be ones that you enjoy. But the issue here is that they are making it difficult for the native ecology to keep a foothold. So first we've got bastard cabbage. So this particular plant is it has a long taproot. I don't know if you can see. Yeah, you can see me doing this. It has a long taproot that when it gets older becomes really fibrous and it breaks easily. And it also forms these little seed heads here. It looks a lot like broccoli. That's because it's a brassica. The problem with this plant is that the seeds can blow through the wind, birds eat them. They spread all over the place. They're pervasive, and the roots can remain in the soil over, a season. Like the foliage can die back, and then spring comes and it's back again. I found this one the other day while I was out walking, and I just pulled it out and I thought, okay, well, this might be a good example to show people. I did learn recently that you can eat the greens, just like you would like your kale, or if you like to eat broccoli greens or cauliflower greens. It's edible. And the person who wrote this particular recipe said that yeah, they put it in like an Indian dish, but they wish they had just sauteed it up with some garlic and lemon juice. So apparently it doesn't taste too bad. China berry tree. China berry is a hard one because it's also very beautiful, but it shades out other natives. So you might want to, if you see one pop up, just kind of clip it before it gets to this point, before it starts flowering and producing berries, which will readily seed in the soil. The plant in the past has been used in Ayurvedic medicine to treat skin ailments. And so you can do a hot compress of them to do that. I'd like to say, though, that I'm not an herbalist. I'm not an expert on these things. These are just things I've read. Some of the things that I tell you about medicinally, I've tried, but it's best to consult the experts on that. So, China berry tree. Wisteria, another really, it's just a gorgeous plant. It's beautiful. And sadly, it is highly invasive. And the way that this plant affects the ecosystem is that it grows these huge vines that wrap around trees, and they kill the trees by girding them. So alternatives to this plant, Texas mountain laurel, although that's better suited for the Edwards Plateau. If you have a very like limestone soil, Texas mountain laurel is great. There's also a native wisteria that you could plant. You want to give your wisterias some good, really moist soil. Probably a riparian area is going to be is going to be good for it. So yeah, wisteria, look out for that one. This one it's a little controversial. Vitex tends to, I mean, it was promoted as a Texas superstar years back, and so now there's a lot of debate about whether or not this plant is invasive. However, yeah, the birds eat the seeds, the bees pollinate it, and it gets into areas where it can do a lot of damage, specifically in riparian and wetland areas. It's a big thorn in the side of conservationists who are doing the good work there. So I'm not sure if, you know, looking for a sterile version of the plant is effective. I mean, obviously that's probably better than planting this particular tree itself. Also, you can harvest the flowers for medicine. It's called chase tree because it was used by monks back in medieval times to reduce libido, and it has been used in reproductive health to sort of support hormones, different hormones. Um, Easy way to do it: take the flowers, throw them in some vodka, seal it up, and then shake the bottle for a couple of months and strain it out, and you've got a nice little chase tree texture or tincture there, excuse me. Nandina is another big invasive plant, also really beautiful. However, these berries that you see here, um, these right here, they actually are poisonous to birds. So in the winter, the berries are present. The birds need food. They go to the berries, they eat them, they gorge on them, and then the arsenic content in the berries can actually it can actually kill birds. So um, this one I've actually taken out in a landscape before, and it sucks to take out. It has these really like fibrous roots that are like kind of yellow on the inside. There's lots of native shrubs that you could plant in place of this that are going to look very similar. Any of the hollies are going to work just as well, and those berries are not going to harm the birds. So now let's talk about some native plants. I wanted to put basically every single native plant that I could in this part, but we kept it to a minimum. So let's start. Okay, heartleaf skullcap. This plant may not actually be native, but it does very well here, and it doesn't harm the ecosystem. It might be more of a naturalized plant. Um, these tubular flowers that it has are great for hummingbirds. They love it. It's a shade-loving plant, so it does very well in shade. It's pest-free because the leaves have pretty high oil content. Also, it spreads on its own. So if you need to plant something that's going to spread out in kind of a shady area, this is a great plant to pick. Yeah. And so here's a chili bequine. This is another, it's a relative of just your basic capsicum annuum plant, and it's another shade-loving plant. The berries, the peppers on this are they're edible by you and the birds, and you're going to get more of a kick out of it than the birds can because they can't sense the capsicum. The peppers are very hot, so something to note, but it's basically a perennial pepper. You know how you can perennialize some of your peppers. This particular one is native, so it will perennialize on its own. And even if the conditions aren't right for perennialization, those peppers will drop and grow more next year. Pokeweed. Pokeweed's an awesome plant. You should note that this is not elderberry, and don't eat those berries like elderberries because they're poisonous to humans, but birds love them. And if you get one of these in your yard, it's just going to come back bigger and bigger every year. Another cool thing about this plant is you can eat the leaves if they're prepared in the right way. There's an indigenous recipe for poke salad that's out there, and yeah, it's from what I've heard, it's a bit like spinach, but there's a long process of cooking that takes the poison out of the leaves. Otherwise, you're probably going to be vomiting and things coming the other way too. So if you do decide to do that, definitely consult a recipe. Here's a great one, Monarda. The Monarda species, we have a couple that you can grow here and they'll benefit the ecosystem. This is the native one, and I think it's probably one of the most beautiful wildflowers that we have. It does like a little bit more moist soil than some of our other wildflowers. So remember that if you do plant it, it's technically an annual, but all of these little areas right here, these little tendrils that sprout these flowers or that grow these flowers are going to turn into seeds at the end of the season. Another cool thing about this plant is look how complex it is. It's actually going to support a lot of different pollinators. So pigeonberry is a really fun shade-loving plant. And these flowers on the spike here attract lots of tiny solitary bees, flies, and they turn into berries that birds love to eat. And this is another plant that does like maybe a little bit moisture soil, but it's a good one to grow. And here we go with Eryngium, Leavenworth syringum. This is a great plant for a full sun area, lots and lots of dry soil, likes dry soil. It's a member of the carrot family, and it tends to add interest, kind of like the inland sea oats do, over the course of the seasons. It blooms in spring and then continues to develop in fall, and then it turns golden. And yeah, so you've got this lovely flower that goes from green to purple to gold over the course of many seasons. It's a great plant, especially if you have some rangeland you want to conserve. Another really cool complex flower is Dakota mock vervain. It's also called prairie verbena. Another great plant that loves dry soil, full sun, and it's a long blooming plant too. It attracts butterflies, bees, lots of different pollinators. Partridge pea is a great shrub to grow. Gets about maybe 3 or 4 feet tall. It's a legume, so it fixes nitrogen into the soil. So if you want to plant natives that are going to support your soil, maybe you'd like to grow something else there later. It's a great one. It also hosts the, I forget what this particular caterpillar is called. I think it's called maybe a sulfur, one of the sulfur butterflies. So those are those yellow butterflies that you see everywhere. When I approached this particular plant, I couldn't tell what was a pod and what was a caterpillar, but there were tons of caterpillars just all over it, feasting on it. This is one of my favorites, but don't tell the other plants. This is double purple datura. So this beautiful trumpet flower, just it comes, I think it blooms in summer, and then you've got it through fall. And it's such a host. It's a feeder and a host. Like all solanaceous plants, it hosts Manduca species, so your sphinx moths, your five-spotted hawk moth. And then over here on the left, you can see there's like 3 wasps and 2 cucumber beetles doing their thing. Like there's a lot going on. So yeah, this is a great one. Note that this plant in particular is poisonous. So if you have curious pets or children, you probably don't want to plant this one in an accessible area of your landscape. So let's talk about maintaining your native habitats. So in winter, you can really just, you don't have to trim your perennials down until spring arrives. So you can leave those stems. Those stems are going to help support insects that need to nest inside of the stems to survive, or bees. There's different kinds of bees that nest in various plant stems. Um, and you can rake your grasses. You don't have to use machinery to shear the grasses into like this little palm. They'll do just fine if you just take your hands and just rub them through. And this is going to bring all of those dead pieces of grass out, and any new growth will remain. It's much gentler for our insects that are overwintering. You can let your flowers go to seed. Those flowers become forage for native birds. And also, they just kind of look cool, in the winter when not a lot is growing. You can provide mulch to your plants, and that's something that you want to do in a cottage garden. You want to protect those prairie plants with mulch, so that they don't, they're not subject to cold and freezing weather as much. And it helps retain moisture through times of extreme weather. You've heard leave the leaves, and the reason for that is you've got all kinds of insects nesting in those leaves. You've got insects that nest below the soil, and the leaves will help sort of protect them and keep things moist and warm for them. Those leaves can break down over the course of the winter months and provide fertility to your soil through leaf mold. And it's also, they're a great mulch. And when you're ready to clear those leaves in the spring, use a rake instead of a leaf blower, because the rake is much more gentle. The leaf blower is blowing air at like 70 miles per hour, which for anyone who's who's in that, it's not very pleasant, and insects can really suffer harm through that process. In your cottage style garden, now is a great time to remove your annual weeds. And you want to keep doing that so that they don't take over spaces where you're trying to grow these lovely natives. You can trim up your bunches, if you can leave the stems, but you can also kind of like trim away some of the more scraggly parts. And then when spring arrives, you want to divide your perennials that have been growing over a couple of seasons. This not only helps you like have native plants in other areas of the garden, but it also helps you keep them from overtaking an area, keeping the space clean. And then if you want, you can pot those up and give them to friends or take them to your local plant trade. There's lots of stuff you can do with them. So here are some resources that you can access. And when I send over this PowerPoint to y'all, I will include actual links to these. And we'll try to include that in the PowerPoint or in the YouTube video as well. So you have access to those. Yeah, there's a lot of information out there, a lot of organizations out there really pulling for this, really pulling for the benefit of native species. So yeah, so there's there's plenty out there, and this does not even like touch on the even the tip of the iceberg here, but some okay resources. So to sum it up, let's remember, native plants are a great way to save time, money, energy. They're a great source of habitat, food, and recreation for wildlife. By planting more, you get to support the ecosystem, and you get to enjoy the results from that, the return of plants and animals to the area where you live. And that's probably one of the coolest things about native plants that you'll notice going forward. So thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this presentation. You can feel free to reach out to me at my email there. Please check out the Texas Petal Project website. We're doing a lot of cool stuff this year. We've got a community garden plot. We've got some other workshops coming up. I think a seed paper workshop, potentially a seed ball workshop too. So yeah, very much appreciate your attention and your time. And I hope you get out there and plant some native plants. Oh,